I'm Emma Gomez, and my topic was the United States and Guatemala during the Cold War. What is the Cold War? The Cold War started in the year 1947 and didn't end until December 3rd, 1989. This period was a time of geopolitical tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Allies were also involved, which included the Western and Eastern Bloc. The Cold War began shortly after the ending of World War II. The Cold War definition is a war where nations have conflict but no military action has taken place. Background on the Guatemalan Revolution. The Guatemalan Revolution began in 1944 and ended in 1954. This was a period where leaders and dictatorships were being overthrown. The United States first overthrew dictator Jorge Ubico in 1944, and then in 1954 the United States orchestrated coup d'etat, overthrew Jacobo Arbenz. After the overthrow of Jorge Ubico, Juan Jose Arevalo became leader, who was later replaced by Jacobo Arbenz. The background continued. Seeing their leader removed in 1944 was a first for Guatemala. Another first was the democratic elected government in their nation's history. The Guatemalan government had launched a serious effort at land reform and land redistribution to Guatemala's landless masses. This resulted in an American-owned fruit company losing numerous acres of land, and it wasn't up until then when the United States started to believe that communism was at play. The start of the U.S. and Guatemala fighting. The United States and Guatemala started their conflict on June 18, 1954, and ended on June 27, 1954. With the goal of containing communism, the United States made a decision on foreign policy. The United States intervened in Guatemala in 1954 and removed their president, Jacobo Arbenz. The United States did this to maintain their hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. So what actually happened? The Guatemalan coup d'etat, which was a codename covert operation called PBS Success, was carried out by the United States CIA. Their main goal of this operation was to remove Guatemalan President Jacobo Arbenz and end the Guatemalan Revolution, which was going on from 1944 to 1954. Because of this, a new dictatorship had begun in Guatemala, and that was under Carlos Castillo Armas. He was the first of a series of U.S.-backed rulers in Guatemala. This was the United States' attempt to save Guatemala from what they believe was an international communism wanting to gain a foothold in the Western Hemisphere. More of what happened. By the end of 1953, going into 1954, the United States was determined to remove Jacobo Arbenz from power. The CIA was given this operation by President Dwight D. Eisenhower. In June of 1954, the CIA started propaganda over the radio to Guatemala and began doing small bombing raids with unmarked airplanes. Arbenz resigned on June 27th. The Arbenz government was totally isolated by the United States. On July 8, 1954, Castillo Armas was elected president. This was deemed as a success for the United States. John Foster Dulles, who was Secretary of State at the time, declared Guatemala had been saved from the communist imperialism. So how did the Guatemalans react? The Guatemalans didn't have a good reaction to what had happened. While the United States had deemed the operation as successful, several Guatemalans had a different perspective. Thousands of suspected communists were rounded up and hundreds of prisoners had been executed. In 1944, labor unions had flourished, but after what had happened, they were completely crushed. However, the United Fruits land, which I mentioned earlier, was in fact restored. Castillo Armas was assassinated in 1957. So how did President Castillo Armas do? While the United States had thought Castillo Armas was a great new fit for Guatemala, Guatemalans thought different. Armas took away voting rights to illiterate Guatemalans. He was also faced with resistance and lacked a significant amount of support from Guatemalans. Detention camps were built to keep prisoners, and a numerous amount of people had been arrested or just disappeared without a trace. However, he was able to make the lives of poor farmers exceptionally better with his new land reforms. Like I said earlier, in 1957, he was assassinated, and many Guatemalans were relieved. So why is the fighting between the U.S. and Guatemala significant? The United States and Guatemala conflict during the Cold War is significant because of numerous reasons, one of them being that according to the CIA, elites in Guatemala were persuading United States journalists and officials that they were moving towards communism. Once the United States overthrew Jacobo Arbenz, they found no hard evidence that tied them to the Soviet Union. Psychological warfare was very significant during this time as well and played an important role in the overthrow of Arbenz. The outcome of the overthrow was that it was seen as shameful and severely damaged America's interest in Latin America. The United States also had claimed they had nothing to do with the coup. The United States also refused to provide Guatemala with any aid for the administration of both Arevalo and Arbenz, but when Armas became president, they aided his administration with $80 million. Okay, so now let's get into the timeline and the overview of the whole thing. So in 1947 is when the Cold War began between the United States and the Soviet Union. This was an important time because the U.S. wanted to prevent communism while the Soviet Union did not. In 1944, the Guatemalan Revolution had begun, and this time was significant to understand because it was a period of time where leaders started to be overthrown, which was a first for Guatemala. And then in 1954, this is when the conflict between the United States and Guatemala officially began. The U.S. was being persuaded to think that President Jacobo Arbenz was moving towards communism, so they made a plan to overthrow him. Now, continuing on in 1954, this time was very significant because the U.S. had been planning to overthrow Arbenz, and before they did it, they had small bombings and raids, and soon after Arbenz was overthrown, President Castillo Armas became president. Again in 1954, it was a significant year of conflict. Guatemalans were angry with the U.S. and labor unions had begun completely crushed. Armas, however, wanted to return the economy back to how it was and help the lives of many poor farmers. Eventually, in 1957 is where the story comes to an end. President Castillo Arbenz was assassinated while some Guatemalans were relieved, others weren't. The U.S. had backed him up, but Armas was the first in a series of leaders backed up by the U.S. And finally, we have our works cited. Thank you for listening.